All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. We are continuing our exploration of the new sincerity in the literature of the late 20th century and early 21st century. We looked at David Foster Wallace, whose theories about overcoming irony in fiction and nonfiction and endorsing what he called single entendre principles that had only one meaning, proved very influential, and I think a contemporary of Wallace's, of Wallace's, who could also be said to exemplify this trend of the new sincerity, is George Saunders. And like Wallace, Saunders uses certain tropes and tricks that you associate with postmodernism, particularly in his case, in Saunders' case, irony, as in Wallace's case it was a meta-fictional or meta-non-fictional approach, to actually undo postmodernism from within and move it toward a kind of ethic of truth, an ethic of expressing certain kinds of moral truth and principles. And Saunders does this mainly through his short fiction. He's mainly known as a short story writer, though he has written one novel. So who is George Saunders? He was born in 1958 in Amarillo, Texas, but raised in Oak Park, Illinois. He was raised as a Catholic and has sometimes spoken of his religious upbringing as partially an influence on his work, though he is now a student of Buddhism. He, unlike some of the writers we read, he does have a science background rather than a literary one in terms of his undergraduate education. Here we might compare him to Thomas Pynchon, of whom that was also true. So he earned a Bachelor of Science degree from the Colorado School of Mines and worked throughout his early adulthood, I think throughout his 20s and into his 30s, as I'm sorry, I don't even really know what the term for what he was doing is, to be honest with you. But he worked in oil fields and also as a technical writer, using that degree, that Bachelor of Science degree from the School of Mines for a while, for his early adulthood. But then he decides to become a creative writer, and he enters Syracuse University for his Master of Fine Arts degree, which is similar to all the other writers we've read so far in the late 20th century. That Master of Fine Arts degree becomes sort of your passport to the literary world, and he later became a professor of creative writing at Syracuse, and he remains one to this day. In fact, his most recent book is a nonfiction book that attempts to replicate the famous class he teaches at Syracuse, which is a study of Russian short stories in translation for writers. So it's a class on how some certain famous 19th century classic Russian writers put their stories together to be effective. We're talking about Tolstoy and Chekhov and Turgenev. If you're familiar with that body of literature, that's actually his most recent book. So he's kind of moved into this nonfiction pedagogy of creative writing. So he's very into that creative writing world. And I think his stories themselves have become a model of creative writing, especially with a certain shift that we see in late 20th and early 21st century American literary fiction that I want to discuss in a moment. So, or actually I just want to discuss it now. So he's known for short stories that combine satirical, science fictional, and magical realist elements to comment on capitalism, corporate culture, and the moral responsibility of citizens when faced with these things. So I think with Saunders, I think one of the things that makes him an important writer is with him you really see a shift away from the generation of Raymond Carver. So Carver, if you remember, wrote realistic short stories. They were about lower middle class or working class life. They didn't really have supernatural elements or any elements of what we were talking about earlier in the semester of genre fiction. There was no element of mystery or science fiction or horror. And if Carver was really the standard bearer of the short story as it was taught in MFA creative writing programs in his period, I think in many respects he's been sort of replaced by Saunders. And I think what that shift means is a shift away from realism, which I think has really been evident in the last 10 to 20 years, that American literary fiction is no longer realist in opposition to popular fiction, which uses genre elements. I think all of these genre elements of science fiction, detective fiction, fantasy, horror, etc., have now been sort of taken on in literary fiction, in that fiction that is sold as the proper reading material of educated people, and tends to end up in literary anthologies and tends to be reproduced in its effect by being taught in these MFA programs. So Saunders, who unashamedly uses magical realist elements, satire, science fiction, and fantasy in some of his work, I think shows that shift. That's not to say that realism has gone away. Another writer we're going to read this week of the same generation of Wallace and Saunders is Jhumpa Lahiri, and Jhumpa Lahiri does write realist fiction, and is maybe in some sense the heir of Carver as probably the most acclaimed realist short story writer of her generation. But Saunders and Wallace and Junot Diaz, who we're going to look at this week as well, they're not, the work we're going to look at doesn't really show you this, but some of his other work does. I think Saunders, Wallace, Diaz show this transition into this breakdown of genres and this kind of overcoming of realism, in the sense that realism is no longer the standard. It's no longer the thing you have to write if you're a serious writer, as it was in the 1950s. And this, I think this breakdown is a key aspect of late 20th and early 21st century fiction. So Saunders, I just quote from the bio in the Norton. He is interested in sort of satirizing the jargon of business management, the platitudes of marketing, the cliches of popular psychology, and the euphemisms that blind people to violence of all kinds. Within the distilled form of the short story, Saunders creates characters partially trapped in these ways of speaking and thinking, who struggle to bend their language to more moral or soulful human ends. So again, note, he's interested, like Wallace, in the same things the postmodernists were interested in this language of advertising, of business, of these signs and simulacra that sort of wall us in this prison of representations. And yet he's interested in escaping from that. And he's interested in a kind of social escape, a moral escape, and he's interested in using language, literary language, to break through the simulated language of postmodernism to tell moral truths in the way that David Foster Wallace was. So I think one way to think about Saunders is that the irony in his work is not really postmodern irony, it's traditional irony. If you remember this distinction I made weeks ago when I was introducing postmodernism, we said that traditional irony relied on the audience knowing what was true, or true to fact or true to morality, so that when the author dashed your expectations of what was true, it almost emphasized the truth more. That's kind of an abstract way to put it, but in verbal irony, you say the opposite of the truth. And you have to know the truth to know that the opposite of the truth is being said. In situational irony, what is not expected because it's not right comes to pass. But you have to know what's expected and what is right to know what's gone wrong. And in dramatic irony, the audience knows more than the characters, and there by definition the audience knows the truth, as the characters do not. In postmodern irony, every element of the text is somehow suspect for being false, which means that there's no standard of truth to which you could compare it. In writers like Pynchon and Ashbery or Don DeLillo, the sort of waning of affect, the draining away of emotion, the sense that everything could be a kind of joke or just a false representation hangs over the whole text in such a way that you don't ever know how to take any of it seriously, or how seriously to take the whole thing. Saunders, I think, returns us in his fiction to a more traditional sense of irony. I'm using this word satire. Satire is when you mock a certain social or political state of affairs, and you mock it from the position of knowing what a better one would be. You can't have satire in postmodernism. I would contrast Saunders to Delilah. Remember Delilah, there's that scene in White Noise we read where Jack's wife is reading tabloid magazines to these older people at the evacuation center, and Jack thinks to himself, well, how can I judge these people for believing this? What do I know? What do any of us know about anything? So Delillo's not really satirizing the tabloids. I mean, there's a gentle, persistent air of mockery of all human belief and knowledge, except that one that comes through the message that his daughter receives in his sleep, Toyota Celica, which is funny but becomes a kind of spiritual access to something beyond the prison of representation, but it's nothing Jack could know. It's nothing Jack could articulate as a social or political critique. There's a vague hint in Delilah that some spiritual remnant is left beyond the world of representation, and he gives you that hint, but it's nothing that could be formalized as a critique of his society. In Saunders, as in Wallace, I think we find something much more traditional. And in that sense, it's no accident that Saunders' latest work is this book about a bunch of 19th century writers, many of whom were very earnestly political, spiritual seekers. And Saunders' first novel, which he released a few years ago, was also set in the 19th century. It's a very strange novel about Abraham Lincoln and the ghost of Abraham Lincoln's son. It's called Lincoln in the Bardo. Bardo being a Buddhist concept that reflects Saunders' interest in Buddhism. And that, again, is a book that has a very clear, I think, kind of moral message, almost one didactic by the end. You're sort of beat over the head with it. I don't mean to criticize. I do mean to criticize, but nevertheless, let's read this 1990s short story by Saunders called CivilWarLand in Bad Decline. I want to pick out a few passages and make a few comments on Saunders' new sincerity, his satirical approach. So the overall concept of the story is that it's set in a kind of Civil War themed amusement park. And the narrator is someone who works in this park, and the park is sort of beginning to run down. It's getting old, there's not as much interest, and it's falling prey to crime. There's these gangs that are preying in the park. So the story narrates the last phase of this park's existence, more or less. And the narrator keeps saying, and this is one of the things that Saunders often comments on, is that he knows that this is the situation is getting out of hand, but he has these two kids. He has to make money. So he's trapped into making the moral compromise of continuing to work at this park while the situation deteriorates. And Saunders is very interested in how people, especially working class and middle class people, end up morally compromising themselves by working for unethical businesses or living sort of unethical lives within the consumerist capitalist system, because we sort of feel like we have no economic choice. We have to pay the bills, we have to feed our kids, we have to take care of our families, and so we end up ethically compromised. Now, what is the nature of the ethical compromise? Well, as I said there, the park is becoming prey to this criminal activity. So the man who runs the park, Mr. Agsuda, I don't remember. He's just called Mr. A for most of the story. I think you only hear his name once. He is trying to get people to work there that will privately take care of the crime. And so that's why I've called this slide Privatizing Law and Order. So law and order was a phrase used a lot in the 80s and 90s. Starting in the 60s and then ending in the early 2000s, there was a large crime wave in American cities. And this is actually one of the things that led to some of the political developments I was mentioning in earlier lectures. I think it was one of the things that powered the rise of the political right, the sort of blowout elections that Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush won in the 80s and 90s. Um, and then the election that George W. Bush won. I think that I guess he won 2 elections. These were, I think, one of the backgrounds to that turn toward conservatism in our culture was as a response to this high crime era. So law and order, the restoration of law and order, became a political theme, often with racial overtones, because there was this stereotype, there were racial stereotypes of who were committing the crimes in America's urban centers. And I mention this because I think that Saunders himself doesn't allude to this in the story, but I think it's necessary background information to understand what the meaning of the Civil War as the theme of this amusement park is for the story, because Saunders is using the Civil War as this motif of these unresolved issues in American life, this history of violence in America that is premised on struggles over ending or maintaining racism. So Saunders is basically mocking and satirizing this concern with law and order and the way that that turned out to interact with a conservative politics of privatization. So the theme of conservative politics, and then of the politics of the Democratic Party, who began to imitate the Republicans to imitate their electoral success in the Bill Clinton era, was that, as Bill Clinton said, the age of big government is over. So the government would no longer sort of regulate markets, would no longer concern itself to the same extent as it had in the 1960s or the 1940s with redistributing wealth. The government would take a hands-off approach, and corporations would sort of fill that vacuum of social services. And so what happens in the story is that the man who owns the amusement park privatizes this idea of law and order by trying to hire people who will take care of this criminal element in the park. And eventually what he does is he hires this man who had committed war crimes in Vietnam, and this guy just begins sort of rampaging and shooting up the place. And he is sort of balanced with this ghost that the narrator keeps encountering, the ghost of this family who lived at the time of the Civil War. And you later learn that the patriarch of the family murdered the family presumably because of the sort of PTSD he was experiencing from the war. So Saunders is using all these allusions to suggest that American history has been this long string of sort of private violence over issues, particularly related to race and related to the rapacity of capitalism and its privatization of all social functions and its decomposition of the social. So we're definitely getting a kind of overt left-wing critique here. And I think that is generally the political keynote of Saunders' work. So for this passage, I just want to note that, Mr. A is talking about societal order, but this is a point where he's trying to convince another one of his workers to put live ammo in his weapon, because the idea is they all carry around these guns that don't have live ammo in them as part of the war theme, but he suggests live ammo so he can shoot the intruders. And Mr. A says to him, act like a mercenary. So that's what social order has become in the late 20th century in America from Saunders' point of view. This mercenary privatization of racialized violence in the name of law and order. And this violence, as I said, goes back quite a way. So one of the climactic moments of the story is when the narrator learns, or at least reveals to us, that Mr. McKinnon, the father of the Ghost family, and again, note Saunders' completely casual use of magical realism. There's no big deal here. It's just, oh yeah, there's ghosts. There's ghosts in the story, and you're just sort of supposed to accept it. So Saunders makes use of magical realism. And when the narrator learns or reveals to us that Mr. McKinnon had killed his family, he narrates Mr. McKinnon running after his family. He's shouting for forgiveness. He's shouting that he's just a man. He's shouting that hatred and war made him nuts. I start running down the hill agreeing with him. And then what happens later in this passage is another ghost appears, the ghost of one of the teenagers that Sam, the Vietnam vet, who had been a war criminal, had killed. And this ghost helps the narrator up and says, it essentially it asks him to keep living and to make amends. And so all of America seems to be haunted by the bodies of these people who were consumed in this violence over what kind of country we would be in terms of race, class, how our economy would be set up. And that is, again, the theme of the Civil War as a symbol of this unresolved American history. Now, my invocation of history here, though, might be leading you to think, what does this have to do with the end of history that we were talking about in my lecture on David Foster Wallace? I think it has to do with the following. I think Saunders, I think one of the ways that Saunders is like the writers that came before him, like Raymond Carver, like James Baldwin, like some of the writers in the realist tradition, is he places almost all the emphasis on in his fiction on the power of empathy to be socially curative. And why do I say that that's a kind of end of history idea? Well, because if you place all your faith in social transformation in changing the way people feel, in insisting that people feel something for other people that they don't currently feel, then you've moved away from solutions that are systematically ideological, that are sort of, like Marxism. In Marxism, nobody cares how anybody feels exactly. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but the point is to change the social structure, to change who owns the means of production in society, to change who's in charge of society, and that will alter the way society functions. And in fact, a change in people's feelings will come from that change in the social structure more than the reverse. For Saunders, though, empathy is the key thing. Just as this story ends in certain ways very similarly to Cathedral, even though I said that Saunders is very different from Carver, this story and Cathedral both end in this empathetic epiphany where the narrator begins to feel what another person feels. And that seems to be the agent of social transformation. But that's very similar to saying the age of grand ideology and grand narrative is over, and we just have to extend democracy and human rights to more and more people. We just have to change how people feel so that they'll treat each other better. And in that sense, I think Saunders is a writer at the end of history. So how does the story end? So it ends with the narrator's death. He's being killed by Sam, and then the narrator enters into Sam and sees his past life. Possessing perfect knowledge, I hover above him as he hacks me to bits. I see his rough childhood. I see his mother doing something horrid to him with a broomstick. I see the hate in his heart and the people he has yet to kill before pneumonia gets him at 83. I see the dead kid's mom, unable to sleep, pounding fists against her face in grief at the moment I was burying her son's hand. I see the pain I've caused. I see the man I could have been and the man I was, and then everything is bright and new and keen with love, and I sweep through Sam's body trying to change him, trying so hard, and feeling only hate and hate, solid as stone. So the narrator's death is a liberation into this ability to empathize with everyone. And this leads him to this feeling of keen's like sharp, so everything is sort of sharply visible through this lens of love, this universal love that the narrator feels upon his death. And if everyone would feel that, then everyone would be able to be a different person. I see the man I could have been, he says, through this lens of perfect love, and the man I was. And note again that backs up this idea that the story relies on traditional irony. He knows what should have happened and he can measure what did happen against it. He can measure the falsehoods he committed against the truths he should have told. And if the story does end on a note of despair, because he can't change Sam. Sam is going to go on killing people until he dies of natural causes at the age of 83. That's probably Saunders's, I think, honesty about the limits of this politics of empathy. And yet this politics of empathy is all that he finally offers us. And it is perhaps in the work of the new sincere writers that empathy, which had been a theme in writers like Baldwin and Carver, becomes almost an official ideology in itself of the literary class, of the MFA getting classes. And some of the negative reviews that Saunders' latest book have received have referred to him as the leader. One of them referred to him as the leader of the empathy industrial complex. This idea that empathy, which was an idea that had a certain critical force when James Baldwin was using it back in the 50s, has now just become a cliche, like just a corporate cliche, a university cliche, a political cliche, like mindfulness, or I bet I don't mean to judge anybody if you're into this, wellness, mindfulness, empathy. All of these things are ideas that started somewhere where they possessed a certain force and a certain novelty, but have now just become the thing everybody says as an excuse to go on with whatever they were already doing, and perhaps has led to a kind of decadence in fiction writing, where fiction writing, if it has abandoned the corrosiveness of postmodern irony, as you find it in a writer like Delilah, has entered into a kind of neo-sentimentalism, as people who don't like George Saunders would, I think, want to call it. And I think that, for all those reasons, I think Saunders is maybe the perfect example of the new sincerity, however we judge it, whatever we judge it to be. So that's George Saunders, and that's the end of this lecture. Thanks very much, and have a great day.